The expensive crystal vase shattered against the marble floor, and that was it. The nanny grabbed her designer purse, looked at the millionaire standing in the doorway, and said 5 words that had become all too familiar. I quit. I'm done here. Richard Whitmore watched another nanny walk out of his penthouse apartment. He didn't even try to stop her anymore. This was the 12th one in 6 months. 12 highly qualified, experienced child care professionals who couldn't handle 2 7-year-old children for more than a few weeks. The British woman who just left had lasted exactly 3 days. Before her, there was the French au pair who made it 5 days. Then the German governess who stuck around for 2 weeks before having what she called a complete mental breakdown. The longest anyone had lasted was a month, and that woman left in tears, saying she'd rather work with 20 children than these 2. Richard stood there in his $4,000 suit, looking at the broken vase. It had belonged to his late wife. The twins knew that. That's exactly why his daughter had thrown it. He loosened his tie and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. From up here, the city looked peaceful, organized, beautiful, nothing like the chaos inside his home. Down below, tiny cars moved through the streets like everything was normal. Like somewhere down there, parents were putting their kids to bed with bedtime stories and goodnight kisses, like it was all so simple. But nothing had been simple for 2 years. Not since the accident. Not since their mother died. His twins, Sophie and Nathan, weren't bad kids. He knew that. They were hurt kids. Angry kids. Scared kids who'd watched their whole world fall apart and decided that if everyone they loved was going to leave anyway, they might as well push people away first. It made sense. Richard understood it. His therapist explained it. The child psychologist explained it. Everyone explained it. But understanding something and fixing it were 2 very different things. Richard ran a technology company worth hundreds of millions. He could solve complex problems, negotiate impossible deals, turn failing businesses into success stories. But he couldn't reach his own children. Every time he tried, they pulled further away. Every time he looked at them, they looked right through him like he was a stranger. The nannies came with impressive resumes. One had a master's degree in child psychology. Another had raised diplomats' children all over the world. They brought colorful charts and reward systems and structured activities. They tried firm boundaries. They tried gentle parenting. They tried everything the book said to try, and the twins destroyed them all, not with violence, really. It was more calculated than that. Sophie would become completely silent, refusing to speak to anyone for days. Nathan would follow instructions to the absolute letter in the most inconvenient way possible. If you told him to clean his room, he'd take 12 hours doing it, moving each toy 1 inch at a time. They'd hide things, important things. One nanny lost her passport the day before an international flight. It turned up weeks later in the freezer. Another found all her clothes had been moved from the dresser to random places throughout the apartment. Her favorite sweater ended up in the oven, ruined. But the worst part wasn't the pranks. It was the emptiness in their eyes. These 2 kids who used to laugh and play and fill the house with noise had become little ghosts. They moved through the apartment like they were just waiting. Waiting for the next person to leave. Waiting for the next loss. Waiting for proof that nobody stayed. Richard's assistant, an efficient woman named Patricia who'd been with him for 15 years, knocked on his office door the next morning. She'd witnessed the parade of nannies. She'd seen him slowly losing hope. "Sir, I know you said you were done looking, but there's one more application I think you should see." Richard didn't even look up from his computer. "Patricia, we've tried everyone. Every agency in the city knows about us. We're blacklisted. This one didn't come through an agency." That made him look up. Patricia placed a simple handwritten letter on his desk. Not typed, not professionally formatted. Just neat cursive on regular paper. Her name is Rose Morrison. She's 48. She didn't apply for the nanny position. She applied for housekeeping. But when I spoke with her on the phone and mentioned the children, she said something that made me think of them. Richard picked up the letter. It was short. Rose Morrison explained that she'd raised 4 children on her own after her husband passed away suddenly. She'd worked as a housekeeper, a cook, and a caregiver for elderly folks. She wasn't fancy and didn't have certificates. But she knew how to keep a home running when everything felt like it was falling apart. The last line caught his attention. "I can't promise to fix what's broken, but I can promise to show up every day and do my best." Sometimes that's all a house needs. Someone who stays. Richard read it 3 times. There was something honest about it. Something different from all the polished resumes and impressive credentials that had walked through his door. "She knows this is a difficult situation?" he asked. Patricia nodded. "I told her everything. About the twins. About the other nannies. About what happened to their mother. She listened to all of it and said, 'Those babies are hurting. Hurt people need steady people around them, not perfect people.'" Richard made a decision that probably wasn't smart, definitely wasn't conventional, but felt right in a way nothing had felt right in months. Call her. Offer her the nanny salary, but tell her she can keep the housekeeper title if she wants. When can she start? She said she could start Monday if needed. Monday then. That weekend, Richard tried to prepare the twins. They were in the living room, Sophie reading a book she'd already read 10 times, Nathan building and rebuilding the same tower with blocks. So, someone new is starting on Monday. He began carefully. Sophie didn't look up from her book. Nathan knocked down his tower. Her name is Rose. She's going to help around the house. Cooking, cleaning, that sort of thing. Is she a nanny? Sophie asked, her voice flat. Richard hesitated. She's a housekeeper. But yes, she'll be around when I'm at work. They always leave, Nathan said quietly, starting to rebuild his tower. This one will too. Richard felt his chest tighten. Nathan, it's okay, Dad, Sophie interrupted, still not looking up. We don't care anymore. But Richard saw her grip tighten on her book. She did care. They both did. That was the whole problem. They cared so much that pretending not to was the only way they could protect themselves. Monday morning came. Richard had arranged to work from home for Rose's first day, though he wasn't sure why. Maybe he wanted to see if she'd last past lunch. Maybe he wanted to be there when she inevitably quit. The doorbell rang at exactly 8 o'clock. Richard opened the door to find a woman with warm brown skin, her hair pulled back in a simple bun, wearing comfortable clothes and carrying a worn suitcase and an old wooden box. Mr. Whitmore? She had a soft voice but steady eyes. I'm Rose Morrison. She didn't smile too brightly or try too hard. She just stood there calm and real. Please come in. Richard stepped aside. Rose walked into the penthouse and didn't gasp at the view or the expensive furniture or the artwork on the walls. She just looked around like she was trying to understand the space, not judge it. The twins appeared at the top of the staircase watching. They'd gotten good at observing people, figuring out weaknesses, planning their strategy. Rose looked up at them and gave a small nod. Nothing more. No big greeting, no forced enthusiasm, no, "Oh, you must be Sophie and Nathan." Just a simple acknowledgement that they existed. Then she turned to Richard. Where's the kitchen? I'd like to start breakfast. That threw him off. Oh, well, the chef usually. We have someone who comes in to cook, but they don't arrive until... I cook, Rose said simply. If that's all right. I brought some things with me. She lifted the wooden box slightly. Richard found himself nodding. Sure, yes, the kitchen is through there. Rose walked toward the kitchen like she'd been there before, comfortable and unhurried. Richard followed, unsure what to do. The twins crept down the stairs, curiosity overcoming caution. In the kitchen, Rose set down her wooden box and opened it. Inside were recipes on index cards, some handwritten, some yellowed with age. She pulled out a few ingredients from her bag. Fresh eggs, real butter, something wrapped in cloth. She moved through the unfamiliar kitchen with surprising ease, finding pans and bowls, adjusting the stove temperature. She didn't ask where things were. If she needed something, she looked for it. If she couldn't find it, she made do with something else. The twins stood in the doorway watching. They'd planned to ignore whoever came today, give them the silent treatment until they got frustrated and left. But Rose wasn't doing anything that required a response. She was just cooking. She hummed while she worked. Not a tune the twins recognized. Something old and soulful that seemed to come from somewhere deep and genuine. Within 15 minutes, the kitchen smelled like home, like someone's grandmother's house on a Sunday morning. Warm and comforting and real. Rose plated the food, scrambled eggs that somehow looked fluffier than anything the professional chef made, toast with real butter, and something the twins didn't recognize but smelled amazing. Breakfast is ready, she said to no one in particular, setting plates at the kitchen counter. The twins didn't move. Richard started to say something, but Rose caught his eye and gave a tiny shake of her head. She sat down with her own plate and began eating, still humming occasionally. After a long moment, Nathan's stomach growled audibly. Sophie elbowed him, but it was too late. Rose glanced up. Plenty here if you're hungry. No pressure, though. It was the no pressure that did it. Every other nanny had tried to force them to the table, to eat healthy, to follow schedules. Rose just offered and went back to her meal. Nathan inched forward. Then Sophie, not wanting to be left out. They climbed onto the stools at the counter, still suspicious but curious. Rose pushed the plates toward them without comment and continued eating her own breakfast. The twins tried the food. The eggs melted in their mouths. The mystery item turned out to be something Rose called biscuits, which weren't cookies but weren't exactly bread either. They were buttery and soft and possibly the best thing the twins had tasted in 2 years. My grandmother taught me to make these, Rose said quietly, not really talking to them but not avoiding them either. She said you can tell how much love a house has by the bread that comes from its oven. Sophie wanted to say something mean, something to push this woman away. But the food was too good, and Rose wasn't trying hard enough to make it satisfying to hurt her. They ate in silence. Not an uncomfortable silence, just quiet. When they finished, Rose collected the plates. "Thank you for trying my cooking," she said simply. As she washed dishes, the twins drifted away, back upstairs, already confused. This wasn't how it usually went. Nannies tried to engage them, ask them questions, get them to open up. Rose had just fed them breakfast. Richard stood in the doorway, stunned. His children had eaten a full meal without argument. They'd sat at the table without being forced. It was such a small thing, but it felt monumental. He started. Rose dried her hands on a towel. "Just breakfast, Mr. Whitmore, nothing special. Now, would you like me to start with the laundry or the living areas?" She went about her day like it was any other job. She cleaned, but not frantically. She organized, but didn't rearrange everything. She moved through the house with quiet competence, occasionally humming those old songs. The twins watched her from various hiding spots, waiting for the moment she'd try to win them over, waiting for the inevitable disappointment. But Rose just worked. When she passed them in the hallway, she'd nod or sometimes say, "Excuse me, honey," but nothing more. By the end of the first day, nothing dramatic had happened. No breakthroughs, no tantrums, no tests failed or passed. Rose finished her work at 5 o'clock, packed her things, and told Richard she'd see him tomorrow. "How was it?" he asked, searching her face for signs of stress or surrender. Rose considered the question. "It's a nice house. Needs some life in it, but that takes time." She headed for the door, then paused. "Mr. Whitmore, those children upstairs? They're not bad. They're just tired of people trying so hard. Sometimes the best thing you can do for tired people is just let them rest." She left, and Richard stood in his quiet penthouse, those words echoing in his mind. "Upstairs," Sophie said to Nathan. "She'll be gone by Friday." They always are. But something in her voice sounded less certain than before. Rose came back on Tuesday and Wednesday, and by the end of the first week, the twins were more confused than they'd been in months. She wasn't like the others. Not even close. The other nannies had arrived with plans. Educational activities, emotional check-ins, schedules color-coded down to the minute. They'd tried to fix the twins like they were broken toys that just needed the right tools and techniques. Rose just existed in their space. She cooked meals that made the whole apartment smell like someone actually lived there. She folded laundry with the kind of care that made even socks seem important. She hummed while she worked, those old songs that seemed to come from a different time, a gentler world. Sophie tested her on day 3. She waited until Rose had just finished mopping the kitchen floor, then deliberately walked across it with muddy shoes from the planter in the hallway. The other nannies would have gasped. They would have launched into lectures about respect and responsibility and thinking about others. They would have made it a teaching moment, pulled out their psychology training, tried to process the underlying emotions. Rose looked at the muddy footprints, looked at Sophie standing there with defiant eyes, and just got the mop back out. "Floors get dirty," she said calmly, starting to clean again. "That's why we wash them." Sophie stood there waiting for the anger, the disappointment, the frustrated speech. It never came. Rose just cleaned the floor again and went back to whatever she was doing before, still humming. It was the strangest thing. Sophie had wanted a reaction. She'd wanted proof that Rose would get upset and leave like everyone else. Instead, she got nothing but quiet acceptance. That night, Sophie felt something uncomfortable in her chest, something that might have been guilt. She wasn't used to feeling guilty anymore. She'd turned that part of herself off after her mother died. Nathan tried his own test on day 5. He set his alarm for 2 in the morning, crept downstairs and rearranged the entire pantry. Put cereal where the cans belonged, moved all the spices to the bottom shelf, hid the coffee in the very back behind everything else. It took him an hour. He waited in his room the next morning, listening for Rose's arrival. Surely this would break her calm. Everyone needed their coffee, and she'd have to dig through chaos to find it. He heard her come in at 8, heard her go to the kitchen, then silence. He crept to the top of the stairs to listen. More silence. Then the sound of cabinet doors opening and closing. No cursing. No frustrated sighs. Just quiet searching. 20 minutes later, the smell of fresh coffee drifted up the stairs. Nathan came down to find Rose sitting at the kitchen counter with her coffee, the pantry still completely disorganized behind her. She saw him and held up her mug slightly.
Had to hunt for this.
Ended up being an adventure. Found some crackers I didn't know we had. Want some breakfast? Nathan stared at her. Aren't you going to fix it? The pantry? Rose sipped her coffee. I will eventually. But first breakfast. You hungry? It didn't make sense. Nothing about her made sense. She should have been angry. She should have known he did it and called him out. She should have made it into a thing. Instead, she just made breakfast. Later that day, Nathan watched from the hallway as Rose reorganized the pantry. She didn't rush. She didn't mutter under her breath. She just put things back methodically and calmly like it was no big deal. When she finished, she noticed him watching. You did a pretty thorough job mixing things up, she said. Must have taken a while. Nathan's heart pounded. Here it came. The lecture. Rose wiped her hands on her apron. You've got dedication. That's a good quality. Just make sure you use it for things that build up instead of tear down. She walked past him to start another task, leaving him standing there feeling strange and confused. The twins met in Sophie's room that night like generals planning a war that wasn't going how they expected. She's weird, Sophie said. She doesn't get mad, Nathan added. Like at all. It's creepy. Maybe she's just acting. Maybe she'll snap eventually. They all snap. But even as Sophie said it, she didn't quite believe it. There was something different about Rose. Something solid and unmovable, like trying to push against a mountain. By the second week, the twins' strategy started falling apart. It's hard to push someone away who isn't trying to get close. It's hard to fight someone who isn't fighting back. Rose maintained her routine. Breakfast at 8. Cleaning through the morning. Lunch at noon. Afternoon tasks. Home-cooked dinner ready by 6. She never varied much. Never tried to engage them in forced activities. Never asked them about their feelings or how school was going, but she noticed things. Small things. When Nathan spent an entire afternoon building an elaborate structure with his blocks, she walked by and said simply, "That's some good engineering." Nothing more, but Nathan felt seen in a way he hadn't in months. When Sophie was reading in the corner, Rose brought her a blanket without saying anything. It was getting chilly in that spot by the window, and somehow Rose had noticed. Sophie pulled the blanket around herself and kept reading, but something warm spread through her chest. The breaking point came at the end of week 2. Sophie had a nightmare. Not unusual. She'd been having them since the accident. Usually she'd wake up, cry silently into her pillow, and eventually fall back asleep alone. But this time the nightmare was worse. She dreamed about the car crash she hadn't even witnessed but had imagined 1,000 times. She woke up gasping and afraid, and before she could stop herself, she was running out of her room. Her father was traveling for business. The penthouse was quiet and dark. Sophie stood in the hallway feeling small and scared and alone when she saw a light coming from the kitchen. She crept downstairs and found Rose sitting at the counter with a cup of tea and what looked like a cookbook. The kitchen smelled like bread. Fresh bread baking in the oven at 2 in the morning. Rose looked up when Sophie appeared in the doorway. No surprise on her face, no alarm. Just calm acknowledgement. Can't sleep either, Rose asked gently. Sophie shook her head, feeling tears threatening. She didn't want to cry. She'd gotten good at not crying. Rose gestured to the stool next to her. Come sit. Bread's almost done. Sophie climbed onto the stool, still shaking slightly from the nightmare. Rose didn't ask what was wrong. She just poured warm milk into a mug and slid it across the counter. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes. The only sound was the hum of the oven and the ticking of the clock. "My mama used to bake bread when she was sad," Rose said quietly, not looking at Sophie but out the window at the sleeping city. She said kneading dough was like kneading out worry. Push and fold until your hands were tired and your heart was a little lighter. Sophie wrapped her hands around the warm mug. "Are you sad now?" Rose considered the question honestly. "Sometimes. I lost my husband 8 years ago. Heart attack. One day he was there, next day he wasn't. My kids were still young. We had bills. I had to figure out how to keep going when I wanted to stop." It was the first time anyone had talked to Sophie like this, not trying to make her feel better. Not sugarcoating things, just honest truth. "Does it stop hurting?" Sophie asked, her voice barely a whisper. "No, baby. It doesn't stop. But it changes. Gets different. You learn to carry it instead of letting it carry you." Rose glanced at her. "Your mama was special, wasn't she?" Sophie nodded, tears finally spilling over. "Everyone says I should talk about it, that it'll help. But talking about it just makes it feel real again." "Then don't talk about it," Rose said simply. "Not until you're ready. No timeline on grief. It moves how it moves." The oven timer went off. Rose got up and pulled out the most beautiful loaf of bread Sophie had ever seen. Golden brown, steaming, perfect. Rose cut 2 thick slices, buttered them while they were still hot, and put one in front of Sophie. They ate warm bread at 2 in the morning, and Sophie cried quietly while Rose just sat there, present and steady, not trying to fix anything. When Sophie finally climbed back into bed an hour later, she felt something she hadn't felt in 2 years. Not happiness exactly, but maybe the beginning of peace. Nathan had heard Sophie's door open and close. He'd heard her go downstairs. He'd almost followed, but decided to wait and see if this was another test, another way to make the new nanny crack. But in the morning, something was different about his sister. She was quieter, but not in the angry way, in a thoughtful way. At breakfast, Rose made scrambled eggs and toast. Nothing fancy, but Sophie ate without being asked, and when Rose set a glass of orange juice next to her plate, Sophie said something that shocked everyone. "Thank you." Just 2 words. But they were the first kind words Sophie had spoken to anyone who worked in the house in 6 months. Rose just nodded like it was nothing special. "You're welcome, honey." Nathan watched this exchange with wide eyes. Something had shifted. Some wall had cracked. Over the next few days, small changes kept appearing. Sophie started showing up in the kitchen while Rose cooked. Not saying much, just watching. Rose would occasionally hand her something to stir or taste, and Sophie would do it without complaint. Nathan found himself drawn to Rose during his building projects. He'd create these elaborate structures, and Rose would pause in her work to look at them. She never gave false praise. If something was actually impressive, she'd say so. If it was just okay, she'd nod and move on. Her honesty made her compliments mean something. One afternoon, Nathan was struggling with a math problem for homework. He'd been staring at it for 20 minutes, getting more frustrated. His father had hired tutors before, but they always made him feel stupid when he didn't understand. Rose walked by with a laundry basket and noticed him. She set the basket down and looked at the paper. "Math was always hard for me," she said casually. Nathan looked up surprised. "Really? Really? My brain just doesn't think in numbers naturally. Drove my teachers crazy." She pointed at the problem. "But you know what helped? Thinking of numbers like building blocks. You're good at building. Try thinking of it like a structure you're putting together." She didn't sit down and tutor him. She didn't take over. She just offered a different way of seeing it and went back to her laundry. Nathan stared at the problem. Building blocks. He started thinking about it differently, and suddenly something clicked. The answer came to him not because someone explained it better, but because someone showed him he could figure it out himself. He solved the problem. Then the next one. Then the rest of the homework. When Rose came back through, he showed her the finished page. She smiled, a real, genuine smile. "See, just needed to look at it different. You did that yourself." That night, Sophie did something she hadn't done since her mother died. She asked Rose to help her with her hair. Their mother used to braid Sophie's hair every morning. Intricate braids that took time and patience. After she died, Sophie had worn her Hair in simple ponytails because letting anyone else touch her hair felt like betraying her mother's memory. But something about Rose felt safe, different. Not like a replacement, but like someone who understood that some things were sacred. Rose's hands were rough from years of hard work, but they were surprisingly gentle. She braided Sophie's hair slowly, carefully, while telling stories about her own grandmother who had taught her these braids as a little girl. My granny said hair braiding was like storytelling, Rose said, her fingers moving with practiced skill. Each strand is part of the story. By itself, it's just hair, but woven together, it becomes something beautiful and strong. Sophie sat very still, feeling the gentle tug of the braid taking shape. Tears slid down her cheeks, but they weren't all sad tears. Some of them felt like relief. Like maybe it was okay to let someone else care. Like maybe accepting comfort from Rose didn't mean forgetting her mother. When Rose finished, Sophie looked in the mirror. The braids were perfect, different from how her mother did them, but beautiful in their own way. "Thank you," Sophie whispered. Rose squeezed her shoulder gently. "Any time, baby." Richard came home from work that evening to find both his children sitting at the kitchen table with Rose, helping her snap green beans for dinner. They were laughing, actually laughing at something Rose had said. He stood in the doorway, his briefcase still in his hand, just watching. The kitchen was warm and bright, the smell of something delicious cooking. His children engaged and present in a way they hadn't been in so long. Rose looked up and caught his eye. She gave him a small smile, then went back to showing Nathan the proper way to snap the beans. Richard felt his throat tighten. For 2 years, his home had been a place of silence and grief, beautiful and expensive, but empty where it mattered. Now it felt alive again, not in a loud or dramatic way, but in small, real ways. Warm bread, patient conversations, gentle hands braiding hair. Rose hadn't performed miracles. She hadn't fixed everything. The twins were still grieving. They still had hard days. But she'd done something none of the qualified professionals could do. She'd just shown up, day after day, steady and real. Not trying to be their mother. Not trying to make them okay. Just being present while they slowly learned how to breathe again. That night, after the children went to bed, Richard found Rose in the kitchen cleaning up. "They're different," he said. "I don't know what you're doing, but whatever it is, it's working." Rose dried a plate and put it away. "I'm not doing anything special, Mr. Whitmore, just treating them like people, not problems. That's all any of us really need. Someone who sees us and doesn't try to change us." She finished cleaning, gathered her things, and headed home. And for the first time in months, Richard felt something he'd almost forgotten. Hope. By the 3rd week, something remarkable was happening in the Whitmore household. The twins were talking again. Not to everyone, not all the time, but enough that their father noticed. Enough that it mattered. Sophie started coming down for breakfast without being called. Nathan stopped hiding in his room all afternoon. They weren't magically healed or suddenly happy, but they were present in a way they hadn't been since the accident. Rose continued her quiet routine, never making a big deal out of the changes. When Sophie voluntarily set the table for dinner, Rose just said, "Thank you, sweetie." When Nathan asked if he could help with the grocery list, she handed him the pen and paper like it was the most natural thing in the world. But not everyone saw these changes as positive. Richard's mother, Victoria Whitmore, made her monthly visit on a Thursday afternoon. She was a woman who valued appearances, credentials, and doing things the proper way. She'd been instrumental in hiring the parade of nannies, each one more qualified than the last. Victoria let herself in with her key, expecting to find a professionally run household. Instead, she found her grandson in the kitchen wearing an apron, his hands covered in flour, while a black woman she'd never seen before guided him through measuring ingredients. "Nathan?" Victoria's voice was sharp with surprise. "What on earth are you doing?" Nathan looked up, flour on his nose. "We're making cookies, grandmother." "Rose is teaching me." Victoria's eyes swept over Rose, taking in her simple clothes, her working hands, her comfortable presence in what Victoria considered her family's kitchen. "And who exactly are you?" Victoria asked, her tone making it clear she already didn't approve. Rose wiped her hands on her apron and extended one to Victoria. "Rose Morrison, ma'am. I work for Mr. Whitmore." Victoria didn't take her hand. "Work for him doing what?" "Where is the nanny? Where is Mrs. Chen who was supposed to start last month?" Mrs. Chen lasted 2 days, grandmother, Sophie said, appearing in the doorway. Like all the others. Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line. She looked at her granddaughter's neatly braided hair, at her grandson's flower-covered happiness, and something in her expression hardened. "Richard," she called out sharply. Richard emerged from his home office, phone still in his hand. "Mother, I didn't know you were coming today." "Clearly." Victoria gestured toward the kitchen scene. "What is going on here? Who is this woman? And why is she teaching Nathan to bake instead of doing whatever it is you hired her to do?" Richard felt his jaw tighten. "Rose is our housekeeper, and apparently she's teaching Nathan to bake because he asked her to. Is that a problem?" "It's highly inappropriate. You have children who need proper care, proper education, proper supervision, not cooking lessons from the help." The word hung in the air like poison. The help. Rose's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. She'd heard that tone before, that dismissive way of being reduced to a role rather than seen as a person. Sophie's face flushed with anger. "Rose isn't just the help, she's—" "Sophie, that's enough," Victoria interrupted. "Go upstairs. You too, Nathan. I need to speak with your father." For a moment it looked like Sophie might argue, but Rose caught her eye and gave a small shake of her head. The twins reluctantly left, Nathan casting worried glances back at Rose. When they were gone, Victoria turned to Richard. "I want to speak with you privately." In Richard's office, Victoria didn't waste time. "You cannot be serious about this arrangement. That woman has no credentials, no training, no qualifications whatsoever." "She has something better," Richard said quietly. "She has my children's trust. Do you know how many qualified professionals couldn't earn that in months? She did it in weeks. Trust?" Victoria scoffed. "Richard, she's a housekeeper. Your children need proper care from someone with an education, with references, with a background in child development. I did background checks, Mother. She's worked in childcare for 20 years, raised 4 successful children of her own, and has references that are glowing. What she doesn't have is expensive degrees and fancy titles. But she has something none of those credentialed nannies had, the ability to reach Sophie and Nathan." Victoria's expression turned cold. "This isn't about credentials, Richard, and you know it. This is about what's appropriate. What will people think?" There it was. The real issue, not Rose's qualifications or abilities, but how it looked to Victoria's social circle that a black housekeeper had become central to the children's lives. "I don't care what people think," Richard said, his voice hard. "I care about my children. For the first time in 2 years, they're eating meals without arguments. They're laughing. They're engaging with life again. And if you can't see that, if you're more concerned about appearances than their well-being, then maybe you need to examine your priorities." Victoria's face flushed. "How dare you speak to me that way? I'm thinking of those children's future. What kind of influence is this woman having on them? What kind of values is she teaching? Values like showing up every day? Like keeping your word? Like treating people with kindness even when they're testing you? Those kinds of values?" Richard's anger was building, because those seem like pretty good lessons to me. Victoria stood up stiffly. "I can see you're not thinking clearly. When you come to your senses, you'll realize this situation is untenable. In the meantime, I'll be consulting with some professionals about what's best for Sophie and Nathan." She left without saying goodbye to the children. Richard found Rose in the kitchen, calmly cleaning up the cookie-making mess. The twins were nowhere to be seen. "I'm sorry about that," Richard said. "My mother can be difficult." Rose continued wiping down the counter. "No need to apologize, Mr. Whitmore. I've dealt with difficult my whole life." She had no right to speak to you that way. Rose looked up at him then, her eyes clear and honest. "People like your mother, they've been speaking to people like me that way for a long time. I'm used to it. Doesn't make it right, but I'm used to it." "Are you okay?" Richard asked, realizing how inadequate the question was. Rose smiled slightly. "I'm fine. I've got thick skin. But those children upstairs, they heard everything. They're worried I'm going to leave like everyone else. That's what you need to worry about." She was right. Richard found Sophie and Nathan in Sophie's room, sitting close together on the bed like they used to when they were smaller, and scared of thunderstorms. "Is Rose leaving?" Nathan asked immediately. Richard sat down in the desk chair facing them. "Not if I have anything to say about it. Rose is part of our household, and she's doing an incredible job. Grandmother doesn't always understand things that are different from what she's used to. She was mean to Rose, Sophie said, her voice shaking with anger. She treated her like she was nothing. I know, sweetheart. And that was wrong. I spoke to Grandmother about it. But she's going to try to make Rose leave, isn't she? Nathan's voice was small, scared. That's what she does. She fixes things. And she thinks Rose is something that needs to be fixed. Richard felt his heart break a little. His children knew their grandmother too well. Grandmother doesn't get to make that decision. I do, and Rose does. Nobody is making anyone leave. But even as he said it, Richard knew Victoria wouldn't give up easily. She never did. Over the next few days, Victoria launched her campaign. She called family friends who were child psychologists, asking them to evaluate the situation. She researched Rose's background, looking for anything questionable. She even contacted the agencies they'd used before, trying to find a nanny so perfect that Richard would have no choice but to replace Rose. What Victoria found instead surprised her. The child psychologist she consulted, Dr. Helen Chen, reviewed the situation and sent a report that was not at all what Victoria expected. The report noted that both children showed significant improvement in emotional regulation, social engagement, and overall well-being since Rose's arrival. Dr. Chen wrote that Rose provided exactly what the children needed: consistent, non-judgmental presence without the pressure of forced therapeutic intervention. Victoria ignored the report. She dug deeper into Rose's past and found something she thought she could use. Years ago, when Rose's husband had just died and she was struggling to keep her family afloat, she'd written a check that bounced. She'd been arrested, paid heavy fees and penalties, and the charge was eventually expunged. But Victoria had the connections to find it anyway. She presented this information to Richard like she'd discovered proof of criminal intent. This woman has an arrest record, and you have her around your children unsupervised? Richard looked at the paper Victoria had shoved across his desk. He'd known about this. It had come up in the background check. She was a widow trying to feed 4 kids, Richard said quietly. She made one mistake during the worst time of her life. She took responsibility, paid everything back with interest, and it was expunged from her record. The fact that you had to dig this up, that you invaded her privacy like this, says more about you than it does about her. I'm protecting my grandchildren. No, Mother. You're trying to control a situation you don't understand because it makes you uncomfortable. There's a difference. Victoria's face went cold. Fine. If you won't listen to reason, perhaps the children will benefit from spending more time with me. I'll be taking them for the weekend. The children don't want to spend the weekend with you right now, Mother, and I'm not going to force them. We'll see about that. Victoria went upstairs to the twins' rooms. She found Sophie doing homework while Nathan built with his blocks. Pack a bag, both of you, Victoria announced. You're spending the weekend at my house. We don't want to, Sophie said without looking up from her math. This isn't a discussion. Your father clearly isn't thinking straight and you need proper care. Mrs. Henderson will look after you. She raised senators' children. We're not going, Nathan said, his voice firmer than anyone had heard it in months. Victoria's expression hardened. Young man, I am your grandmother and you will show me respect. You didn't show Rose respect, Sophie snapped, finally looking up. You were mean to her, and now you want us to just go with you like nothing happened? We're not going. Victoria realized she was losing control of the situation. Your father will hear about this defiance. Good, Sophie said. Tell him. Victoria left in a fury, but the damage was done. The twins were anxious and upset. When Rose arrived the next morning, she found them quiet and withdrawn. Some of the progress of the past week seemingly evaporated overnight. Rose didn't ask what was wrong. She just started her routine, making breakfast, tidying up, humming her songs. But at lunchtime, when the twins barely touched their food, she sat down with them. Whatever's worrying you, it's big, she said simply. Want to talk about it or want to just sit with it for now? Sophie's eyes filled with tears. She's going to make you leave. Grandmother always gets what she wants. Rose reached across and squeezed Sophie's hand. Baby girl, look at me. I'm not going anywhere unless you and your daddy want me gone. Your grandmother's opinion doesn't change that. I've faced bigger obstacles than one unhappy woman. She found something bad about you, Nathan whispered, something from before. Dad told us about it. About when you were struggling, Rose didn't flinch. The bounced check? Yeah, that happened. One of the hardest times in my life. I made a mistake and I paid for it. But you know what? I'm not ashamed of it. I was trying to keep my babies fed and my lights on. I'd make that same choice again if I had to. Grandmother says you're not qualified to take care of us, Sophie said. Rose leaned back in her chair, considering. Qualified. That's an interesting word. I don't have fancy degrees or certificates on a wall. What I have is 4 grown children who call me every week, who bring their own babies for me to watch because they trust me. I have years of showing up for people when they needed someone steady. That's my qualification. But if your grandmother needs paper to prove I know how to care for people, then maybe I'm not the right fit for what she thinks this family needs. But you're the right fit for what we need, Nathan said urgently. You are. Rose smiled, warmth flooding her eyes. Then that's what matters, isn't it? But later, after the children went to bed, Rose sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea and thought about Victoria's attacks. She'd faced prejudice before, had dealt with people who looked down on her for her work, her skin, her lack of formal education. It never stopped hurting, but she'd learned to carry it. What worried her wasn't Victoria's opinion. It was the disruption this was causing for Sophie and Nathan. They were just starting to heal, just beginning to trust again. The last thing they needed was a battle over who got to care for them. Rose pulled out a piece of paper and started writing. A resignation letter. Not because she wanted to leave, but because she'd learned a long time ago that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is step aside when your presence causes more harm than good. She was halfway through writing when she heard footsteps on the stairs. Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway, her hair messy from sleep. Can't sleep? Rose asked gently. Sophie shook her head and came closer. She saw the paper, saw the beginning of the letter, and her eyes went wide. You're leaving, Sophie whispered, and her face crumpled. You're actually leaving. Rose started to explain, but Sophie cut her off. No.
You can't leave!
You promised you wouldn't leave. Tears streamed down Sophie's face. Everyone leaves everyone, and you said you'd stay, but you're just like all the others. Nathan appeared at the top of the stairs, awakened by his sisters crying. When he saw what was happening, he ran down. Rose, please. Nathan's voice broke. Please don't go. We'll be better. We'll do whatever grandmother wants. Just please don't leave. Rose felt her own tears start to fall. These children, these beautiful broken children who'd lost so much, were begging her to stay. And she realized that by trying to protect them from conflict, she was actually causing the very abandonment they feared most. She crumpled up the letter and pulled both children into her arms. I'm not going anywhere, she said firmly. I'm sorry. I was wrong to even think about it. You two are stuck with me, understand? Your grandmother, my past, none of that matters. What matters is right here, this us. Sophie clung to her, sobbing. Nathan wrapped his arms around them both. They stood there in the kitchen, 3 people who'd all lost so much, holding on to each other like lifelines. Richard appeared in the doorway, having heard the commotion. He took in the scene. Rose with tears on her face, his children clinging to her, the crumpled paper on the floor. What's going on? He asked quietly. Sophie pulled back from Rose and turned to her father. Dad, Rose's family. She's family, and we're not letting her go. We don't care what grandmother says. We don't care about anything except keeping Rose here with us. Nathan nodded fiercely. She stays. Or we leave too. Richard looked at Rose, at this woman who'd given his children back to him, who'd brought life back into their home and made his own decision. She stays, he said simply. And anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me. The morning after the kitchen breakdown, something shifted in the Whitmore household. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was real. The twins had declared Rose as family, and Richard had backed them up. Now everyone waited to see what Victoria would do next. They didn't have to wait long. Victoria called a family meeting at her estate that weekend. Not a request. A summons. She'd contacted Richard's siblings, his late wife's parents, even some of the board members from his company. This wasn't just about Rose anymore. Victoria was making it about Richard's judgment, his fitness to make decisions for his children. Richard knew he had to go. Not going would make him look like he was hiding something, admitting fault, but he refused to leave the twins with anyone else. We're all going, he told Rose on Friday afternoon. You included. Rose shook her head. Mr. Whitmore, that's not a good idea. This is a family matter. You are family, Sophie said firmly from the doorway. She'd been listening. Dad said so. Nathan and I said so. That makes it true. Nathan appeared beside his sister. If Rose doesn't go, we don't go. Richard looked at Rose. I know this isn't fair to you. I know my mother has made this incredibly uncomfortable. But those kids are right. You're part of this family now. And families stick together even when things get messy. Rose studied his face for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly. All right, but I need to stop by my place first. If I'm walking into that woman's house, I'm doing it in my Sunday best. Saturday afternoon, they pulled up to Victoria's estate in Greenwich. The house was massive, old money, the kind of place that made people feel small before they even walked through the door. Rose stepped out of the car wearing a deep purple dress, her hair styled beautifully, her grandmother's pearl earrings catching the sunlight. She looked dignified, elegant, and completely unbothered by the mansion looming in front of them. Sophie grabbed her hand on one side, Nathan on the other. They walked up to that intimidating front door like a unit, a family facing whatever came next together. Victoria answered the door herself, her eyes sweeping over Rose's appearance with barely concealed surprise. She'd expected the housekeeper to show up in her work clothes, humble and apologetic. Instead, Rose looked her in the eye with quiet confidence. Mrs. Whitmore, Rose said politely. Thank you for having me in your home. Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line. Yes, well, come in. The living room was full of people. Richard's brother Daniel and his wife, his sister Patricia, the twins' maternal grandparents, George and Linda, several family friends who served as witnesses or judges, depending on how things went. Everyone turned to stare when Rose walked in with the children still holding her hands. This is Rose Morrison, Richard said clearly. She's part of our household and has become very important to Sophie and Nathan. She's here because she's family. Daniel stood up. He was younger than Richard, more concerned with appearances and the family reputation. Richard, with all due respect, this is a family meeting. About family matters. Rose is family, Sophie said loudly. We already said that. Victoria gestured for everyone to sit. Let's all calm down and discuss this rationally. They sat. Rose chose a chair slightly apart from the main seating area, but Sophie immediately went and sat on the arm of her chair. Nathan stood behind them, his hand on Rose's shoulder. The message was clear. Victoria stood at the front of the room like a prosecutor. Richard, we're all here because we're concerned about the children, about their well-being and the influences in their lives. The influence you mean is Rose, Richard said flatly. Let's not dance around it. Fine, yes. Victoria pulled out a folder. This woman has an arrest record. She has no formal education beyond high school. She has no credentials in childcare or education, and yet you've given her complete access to vulnerable children who've already experienced tremendous trauma. George, the twins' maternal grandfather, leaned forward. Richard, is this true? About the arrest? It's true, Richard said. Rose wrote a bad check years ago when she was a struggling widow trying to feed her children. She paid it back, paid the penalties, and the charge was expunged. It's the kind of mistake anyone might make when they're desperate. Anyone? Victoria's voice was sharp. Richard, people in our position don't write bad checks. We don't get arrested. We don't know what it's like to struggle, Rose said quietly. Everyone turned to look at her. She hadn't planned to speak, but something in Victoria's tone pushed her forward. That's what you were going to say, wasn't it? People in your position don't understand what it's like when you're choosing between electricity and groceries. When you're working 3 jobs and still coming up short. When your husband dies and leaves you with 4 children and medical bills that could sink a ship. Her voice was calm but firm. You're right. I did write that check. I knew it might bounce, but my baby needed medicine and I was out of options. I'm not proud of it, but I'm not ashamed either. I did what I had to do to protect my child. Any parent here would do the same if they were honest. Linda, the twins' grandmother, spoke up. Her voice was softer than Victoria's. Rose, I'm not concerned about your past.